She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand up for herself, at least not in the way they expected. But 20 minutes after being humiliated in first class, this woman made a single phone call. And the next announcement over the intercom shook the entire cabin to its core. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, what would you have done in her shoes? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to hit that like button if you believe dignity always deserves a seat at the front. Now, let's begin. It was just past 6 a.m. at JFK, and the airport pulsed with quiet urgency. Travelers clutched coffee cups, flight announcements echoed across wide halls, and security lines crept forward in patient misery. Everything moved, but nothing rushed. On Concourse D at Gate 9, boarding had begun for Flight 207 to Chicago. First class was already half full. Blazers, briefcases, and murmured emails filled the air. The cabin had that particular hush, not peaceful, but distant. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being observed but not seen. Then she walked in. Celeste Monroe, 38, stepped through the jet bridge with the ease of someone used to being in motion. She wore a burnt orange blazer over a cream silk blouse, paired with tailored pants and low heels. Her natural curls were pinned back in a soft twist, framing a face that carried both calm and certainty. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, she simply belonged to herself. As she stepped into the cabin, a man in 1B glanced up from his tablet. His gaze lingered, not in admiration but in calculation. His eyes flicked down to her shoes, her carry-on, her skin, then back to his screen. No smile. Celeste didn't flinch. She had seen that look before, more times than she cared to count. She reached her seat, 2A, and began to stow her bag in the overhead bin. That's when she heard it. "Excuse me, are you assisting another passenger today?" A man in a navy blazer had approached from behind, a polite smile plastered across his face. He gestured vaguely at the overhead compartment. Celeste turned to him slowly. "No," she said, voice even. "I'm flying first class today." The man blinked. His smile stiffened. "Oh, my mistake." She gave a nod that could have meant anything, then returned to her task. At the front galley, Gretchen Boyle, the lead flight attendant, was watching. She didn't say anything. She rarely did in moments like this. But her eyes had narrowed, just slightly. Not enough to be noticed, not by most. Beside her stood Isabel Ramos, young, eager, and still learning the difference between what's said and what's understood. She had seen Gretchen pause when Celeste walked in, that subtle change in posture, that tiny hitch in breath. Isabel noticed everything. "Is everything okay?" Isabel asked gently. "We'll see," Gretchen murmured, eyes still fixed on seat 2A. Celeste sat down, crossing one leg over the other with practiced grace. She pulled a small notebook from her purse and began jotting notes. Just bullet points. She wasn't preparing a speech, she was preparing a moment. In less than 24 hours, she'd be standing before a national conference on diversity and ethics in aviation. And now, she had a fresh example to open with. She let out a soft breath. Not a sigh, more like a release. The kind you exhale when you already know what's coming, and you're bracing yourself for it. Isabel began checking the overhead bins row by row. As she passed Celeste, their eyes met briefly. Celeste offered a smile, not bright, not forced. Just enough to say, "I see you." Isabel smiled back, but it faded quickly when she returned to the galley. "She's in 2A, Gretchen said, voice low. "Yes, I saw." "Boarding pass?" "Didn't check. Didn't seem like an issue." Gretchen didn't respond. She just tapped her tablet and straightened her shoulders. The final boarding call was announced. Celeste remained focused on her notes, but her mind was already shifting. She'd felt it the moment she stepped into the cabin. The weight of scrutiny, the subtle hush that greets a disruption in expectations. She had no plans to disrupt anything, but sometimes just being present was enough to make the system glitch. Outside the window, the runway gleamed under the rising sun. Inside, tension settled into the seams of leather seats and starched uniforms. And somewhere between the silence and the shifting eyes, a storm was beginning to form. Celeste clicked her pen shut. It had begun. The plane had nearly finished boarding when Celeste noticed him. Just a few rows behind, seat 4C, an elderly man, tall but bent at the shoulders, was struggling with his carry-on. His fingers fumbled with the handle as the bag swayed dangerously above him, the latch on the overhead bin stubborn as ever. His face showed that quiet desperation, the kind people try to hide behind practiced politeness. He looked around with a silent plea, but no one moved. Celeste didn't hesitate. She rose from her seat, stepped 2 rows back, and gently placed a hand on the bag. "Let me help you with that, sir." The man blinked up at her, surprised, grateful. I appreciate it, miss. These bins aren't what they used to be." She offered a warm, understanding smile, lifted the bag with ease, and guided it into place. Just as she was closing the bin, a voice snapped through the cabin like a breaking whip. "Ma'am," sharp, unmistakable, loud enough to pierce every private moment in first class. "You can't touch other passengers' luggage. Please sit down, immediately." Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even the engine hum seemed to fade. It was Gretchen. She stood several feet away, her voice ringing with that particular tone. Stern, public, unyielding. Her arms were crossed, her gaze locked onto Celeste, not with concern, but with accusation. For a second, no one moved. The elderly man stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "She was helping me," he said, voice quivering, trying to restore some sense of dignity. Gretchen didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes never left Celeste. Celeste stood still, one hand resting gently on the now-closed bin. Her face didn't flinch, her breath didn't change. But in her eyes, there was something deeper. Not shock, not anger, something quieter, sharper. A shift, like the moment before steel turns into a blade. She looked at Gretchen, measured, composed, and without saying a word, turned and walked back to her seat. The click of her heels felt louder now. She lowered herself into 2A with the same grace she'd carried on board. Her notebook sat waiting in her lap, but she didn't open it. Across the aisle, a young mother pulled her daughter closer. A man adjusted his collar and stared fixedly out the window. Several passengers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Isabel, near the beverage cart, had frozen mid-step. She'd heard the tone, felt it. That wasn't a policy correction. That was something else. And she knew it. She turned her head, afraid to meet Celeste's eyes. Celeste looked straight ahead, still silent. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. But something had cracked beneath the surface. Not rage, not panic. Resolve. Because this wasn't the first time. She'd been redirected before. Corrected, asked to move, asked to explain, asked to prove that she belonged, over and over, until it didn't even sting anymore. But somehow, this time did. Maybe it was the way the cabin held its breath. Maybe it was the look on that man's face, humiliated by association. Maybe it was the child staring at her like she'd done something wrong. Or maybe it was just enough. Celeste took a long breath, not to calm herself, to remember. She'd swallowed moments like this all her life. But something about this one tasted different, bitter, final. She turned slightly toward the window, watching the morning sun slide across the tarmac. Outside, the world looked open, limitless. Inside, it felt like a cage lined with velvet. She reached into her purse, not rushed, not flustered, and pulled out her phone. Not to tweet, not to record, just to look at something. A number, one she didn't use often. One that wasn't for emergencies, just moments like this. Her thumb hovered for a second, then tapped. Not call, not yet, but the message was already forming in her mind. Meanwhile, Gretchen had retreated to the front galley. She sipped from her coffee, her jaw tight. That woman, she'd just overstepped. Helping with another passenger's bag? In first class? Without asking? No, that wasn't how things were done. But even as she tried to convince herself, a flicker of doubt crept in. Why had her voice come out like that? Why did it still echo in her ears? Isabel returned to the galley, her face pale. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough. Back in her seat, Celeste finally opened her notebook. Not to take notes, but to write one line. A quote she had memorized, but never written down before. Dignity isn't taken in loud moments. It's stolen in silence. She underlined it once, then closed the notebook, and waited, because the plane was still on the ground. But the turbulence had already begun. The plane had been in the air less than 20 minutes, but the cabin already felt tighter. Like the pressure wasn't just outside, but inside the walls, coiled beneath every seatbelt and tray table. Isabel moved quietly down the aisle, offering drinks with a practiced smile. Her hands were steady now, but her chest still held that earlier tremble. As she approached row 2, her steps slowed. Celeste was seated upright, hands gently folded over her notebook, gaze fixed calmly on the seat in front of her. Unbothered, unmoving, unreadable. Isabel leaned in just enough, her voice soft. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Celeste looked at her. Not with suspicion, not even with gratitude. Just a simple nod, quiet, controlled. But in that single movement, Isabel saw everything. That nod wasn't yes, it wasn't no, it was I see what this is, and I'm not surprised. Isabel stepped back and continued down the aisle, her throat tight. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. From the row behind, two men in suits leaned toward each other. "She didn't do anything wrong," one whispered. "I know. I saw the whole thing. Just helped the guy with his bag. She got barked at like she was a threat." The other nodded slowly. "That wasn't about a bag, that was something else." They didn't say what that something else was. They didn't have to. The words hung in the space between them, heavy and unspoken, like smoke in the air after a match has been struck. Across the aisle, a woman adjusted her scarf and glanced toward Celeste. Her brows knitted together. Concerned? Curious? Maybe both. She leaned into her husband. "I think that woman's someone important," she murmured. She didn't even flinch. The husband shrugged, eyes still on his newspaper. "Well, she's certainly got presence." At the front, Gretchen kept herself busy. She refilled coffee pots, checked inventory, rearranged napkins that didn't need rearranging. But every few minutes her eyes drifted back to 2A. Celeste hadn't said a word since the incident. Not one complaint, not one challenge. That should have been reassuring. But it wasn't. There was something unsettling about her quiet. Not passive, not scared, just watching, waiting. And that made Gretchen nervous in a way she couldn't explain. She reached for her tablet and began checking names again. Just to make sure. Just to regain control. Behind her, Isabel returned to the galley, setting down the empty tray. "Coffee's going fast," she said. Gretchen didn't respond. Her eyes were still locked on Celeste. Back at seat 2A, Celeste sat alone in her stillness. She didn't move, didn't shift, didn't speak. But her fingers slowly reached into her bag, pulling out her phone with the same care one might use to lift a matchstick. The screen lit up in her hand, casting a faint glow over her lap. One contact. No name, just a code. Command line, clearance 9. She tapped it, typed a single sentence, trigger audit, flight 207, gate 9, immediate, no emojis, no punctuation, no context, just clarity. She stared at the message for a moment, not for doubt, not to edit, just to let the weight of it settle before she sent it. Then, send. The screen dimmed. She locked the phone, slid it back into her purse, and adjusted the crease of her blazer. No one had noticed. Not Isabel, not Gretchen. Not the whispering passengers or the man beside her. To them, she was just a woman looking out the window. Composed. Quiet. But behind that stillness, wheels were turning. Quiet gears, oiled with precision, grinding toward something bigger. She wasn't seeking revenge. This wasn't payback. It was protocol, and she had followed it. Across the aisle, a child peered over the seat in front of her, big eyes staring at Celeste like she was watching something sacred, something no one else could understand. Celeste caught the gaze and offered a tiny smile. Just enough to say, "It's okay. You don't need to be afraid of quiet people." Back in the galley, Gretchen paced. Something didn't feel right. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt watched. Not from a camera, not from a manager, but from her. And yet, no complaint had been filed, no confrontation. No one had even asked to speak to the pilot. So why did she feel like she'd already lost control of this flight? She looked down the aisle again. Celeste hadn't moved, and that somehow made it worse. The aircraft had just begun to taxi. Outside the window, the runway stretched long and silent under the morning haze. Inside, tray tables clicked into place, safety cards rustled, and seatbelt lights glowed a steady amber. It was a normal flight, or it looked like one. Until the intercom crackled. There was a pause, a beat too long. Then the captain's voice came through, calm, clipped, and slightly more tense than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received instructions from ground control." Another pause. "We've been directed to return to the gate immediately. This is a directive from the FAA. I repeat, FAA directive. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." And just like that, the hush broke. First came the confusion. Heads turned, brows furrowed. A few gasps. Then came the whispers, rising, swelling like a tide that couldn't be held back. "Wait, what? Return to the gate? What happened? Did they say FAA?" Row 4, the man Celeste had helped earlier, sat upright. His eyes darted toward her, then toward the front of the plane. He didn't say a word, but his hand slowly tightened around his armrest. A woman 2 rows back leaned over to her husband. That's not normal, right? FAA doesn't cancel flights for nothing. And then, like the spark that lights a chain reaction, someone said it out loud. Wait, wasn't that the lady they yelled at earlier? The sentence hung in the air. Raw, naked, heavy. Celeste didn't move. She kept her gaze steady on the tarmac outside. Her face gave nothing away. But Isabel, standing near the galley, felt it. Something had shifted, something irreversible. She looked toward Gretchen, who had gone pale. The lead attendant blinked, hard. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, then quickly reached for the intercom controls. She didn't press the button, not yet. Instead, she turned to Isabel, voice low and tight. Did you hear what he said? Isabel nodded slowly. FAA directive. Gretchen's jaw clenched. That's highly unusual. Her fingers danced nervously over the tablet on the wall, but there were no updates, nothing she could see, nothing she could explain, which only made it worse. She glanced down the aisle, and for a moment her eyes met Celeste's. Still, composed, watching. A shiver ran through Gretchen's spine. She didn't know why, but that look held weight. Not vengeance, not accusation. Something more terrifying. Authority. At the front of the cabin, Captain Emerson Ellis finished his transmission and turned to his co-pilot. You ever had the FAA pull you off taxi without explanation? His co-pilot shook his head. Not mid-roll. Not unless it's serious. Exactly, Ellis muttered, adjusting his headset. This came from high up. Didn't even come through dispatch. It came through a secure FAA line. He tapped the console and leaned back. Meanwhile, the plane slowly turned, nose wheel pivoting, engine humming softer now. The forward motion faded as the aircraft circled back toward Gate 9. The passengers knew something was wrong. You could feel it in their posture, in the shift from casual slouching to alert, upright bodies. You could see it in the way they clutched their phones, waiting for service to kick back in so they could text someone, anyone, for answers. Row 2 had become the quietest place on the plane. Celeste remained still, her shoulders relaxed, her lips uncurved. But Isabel, watching her from the front galley, knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't panic. This wasn't drama. This was orchestration. Celeste Monroe wasn't angry. She was prepared. And that, somehow, was worse. As the plane pulled into the gate, the seatbelt sign remained lit. The intercom came on again. Flight attendants, please remain seated until further instructions. Now even the crew was frozen. Gretchen stood stiffly at the galley wall, staring at the cockpit door like it might open with answers. Her fingers twitched against her side. What the hell is going on? She whispered. Isabel didn't reply. She was still looking at Celeste. And for the first time since the flight began, a strange thought formed in her mind. She's not just a passenger. She's someone they answer to. Celeste's phone vibrated softly once in her purse. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. She didn't need to. Whatever was coming next had already begun. The jet bridge had reconnected. Outside, ground crew moved with unusual urgency. A ramp agent whispered into a radio. 2 security personnel stood near the gate, not tense, but alert. Watching. Inside the cabin, the passengers had gone quiet again. But it wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of questions. The kind people are afraid to ask out loud. Then came the footsteps. Heavy. Intentional. Not rushed. 2 men stepped onto the aircraft. Suits. Badges. Not airport police. Not airline reps. FAA. The taller of the 2 looked around the cabin, his voice calm but direct. We're looking for Miss Celeste Monroe. The name sliced through the air like a blade. Heads turned. Some passengers gasped. A few instinctively looked toward 2A, where she still sat, calm as ever. Celeste slowly rose to her feet. No fuss, no tension, just movement as precise and composed as everything else about her. That's me, she said. 3 words. Smooth, even. But they carried weight. Even the agent seemed to take half a beat before nodding. Miss Monroe, we'd like a word off the aft if that's all right. Celeste glanced briefly at her bag, then looked back at them. Of course. She reached up, retrieved her belongings without struggle, and turned to exit. No dramatics, no lingering looks. But just as she began down the aisle, a voice called out. Soft, unsure. Ma'am? It was Isabel. She had taken a few hesitant steps forward, her face pale with dawning realization. Are you with the FAA? Celeste paused. She didn't speak right away, just offered a small, patient smile. The kind people give when they've been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Then gently, "I've been with the system for 12 years. Another beat. "Today, I'm just here to observe it." And with that, she turned and stepped through the jet bridge, leaving behind silence and stunned faces in her wake. Isabel stood frozen. Her mind raced. Everything clicked into place. The calm, the lack of panic, the precision of her words, the one text. She wasn't just another woman. She was the storm the system didn't see coming. Back in the galley, Gretchen stood stiff against the wall. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. She had heard the name. She had seen the badges. But what rattled her most was the way Celeste had left. Not smug, not triumphant, just in control. Too much control. Gretchen glanced toward the front, where the captain was already unlocking the cockpit door, no doubt summoned to speak with the investigators. For a moment she wondered, what exactly had she triggered? And how far would the fallout go? Gretchen sat stiffly in the small interview room near Gate 9. The chair was hard. The light overhead buzzed faintly. On the table in front of her lay a printed form, half-filled. A small recorder blinked red. One of the FAA agents, Agent Fields, sat across from her, expression unreadable. "Miss Boyle," he began, "we're conducting a preliminary inquiry regarding your conduct during boarding and in-flight service." Gretchen didn't blink. "I was following protocol," she said, her voice tight. "The passenger, Ms. Monroe, was acting aggressively." Fields raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Gretchen pressed on. "She interfered with another passenger's luggage. That's a safety violation." "And did the passenger she interfered with, was he the one who complained?" Gretchen's lips parted, but no sound came. The agent nodded slightly. "Noted." He leaned back, folded his arms. "We're just gathering statements for now. You'll have an opportunity to review the incident through official channels." But something in his tone had shifted. It wasn't just a formality anymore. It was accountability. Meanwhile, Isabel sat alone in the rear lavatory of the aircraft, door locked, her FAA-issued incident report in one hand, pen in the other. Her reflection in the mirror looked paler than usual. Her eyes were rimmed in red. She hadn't spoken since Celeste stepped off the plane. She just nodded when the officer handed her the form and said, "Write what you witnessed. Don't omit anything." But now, staring at herself, she felt like she couldn't breathe. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the pen, because this wasn't the first time. And her silence? That wasn't new either. She looked at herself harder, and the flashbacks came. A year ago, a young black couple boarding first class. Gretchen had raised her eyebrows and said, "Are you sure this is the right boarding group?" The husband had smiled politely, showed the ticket, said nothing. Isabel had smiled too, but inside she winced. She had said nothing. 6 months ago, a teenage boy, maybe 17, boarding alone, backpack slung low, hoodie up. Gretchen had stopped him before the first-class curtain. "This is priority seating." His boarding pass said 1C. She'd let him through, but not without a look. Isabel had turned away. Again, said nothing. 3 weeks ago, a dark-skinned woman asking for a blanket. Gretchen had answered curtly, "We don't have extras." 10 minutes later, a white passenger asked the same thing. Gretchen gave her 2. Isabel had stood right there and pretended not to see. Now in the mirror, Isabel's throat closed. Tears welled up, not from guilt but from recognition. It wasn't just Gretchen. It was the silence that gave her power. If you stay quiet long enough, maybe you start to believe you're not part of it. She pressed the tissue to her face, exhaled, shook her head. Not this time, not again. She took the pen, steadied her hand, and wrote the truth. Everything. Not just what she'd seen, but what she'd felt. When she stepped out of the lavatory, the report was folded and ready, her posture taller, her silence finally broken. Outside Gate 9, a modest crowd had gathered. Passengers with canceled connections stood beside reporters, tipped off by airport staff. Cell phones were raised. Voices buzzed with questions, theories, fragments of what had just happened aboard Flight 207. Then came the statement. A man in a navy blazer, press liaison for the airline, stepped up to the makeshift podium hastily assembled near the terminal monitors. He cleared his throat and looked directly at the cameras. Flight 207 to Chicago has been officially canceled following a federal compliance intervention conducted in coordination with the FAA. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Even those who weren't on the flight now leaned closer, Curiosity sharpened. Behind the speaker, a tall, composed figure stepped forward. She wasn't flanked by bodyguards. She didn't wear a suit of armor, just a burnt orange blazer and a look that silenced the room. Celeste Monroe. She moved with poise, stopping just beside the podium. From her inner jacket pocket, she pulled out a slim leather wallet and opened it. Not for security, not for performance, for clarity. The small badge caught the light. Celeste Monroe, she said clearly. FAA Senior Compliance Investigator. Department of Aviation Ethics. Phones went up instantly. Someone near the front whispered, "Oh my God, she's FAA." Celeste didn't wait for silence. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke. "Let me be clear. This isn't about being shouted at." She let the pause land. Solid, steady. It's about what happens when good people stay silent while bad habits take root in our skies. She turned slightly, meeting the eyes of several passengers from the flight, some of whom still stood wide-eyed behind the cordon. A plane isn't just metal and wings. It's a flying system of values. Every flight reflects the culture we allow, the behavior we normalize, and the voices we choose to hear or ignore. Someone clapped, just one, then another, and then, like the slow rising of something long overdue, the gate erupted in applause. A woman from 4B stood, her eyes wet. A teenage boy from row 6 filmed everything on his phone. The live stream title already typed, #Respect Celeste. This is what justice looks like. The hashtag caught like wildfire. Within minutes, it trended. Airport monitors flashed the news. Comments poured in. This woman just changed aviation accountability forever. This is the kind of leadership we need at 30,000 feet. Not angry, not loud, just powerful. Celeste didn't linger for the praise. She stepped away from the mic, nodded to the press liaison, and disappeared into a hallway beyond the gate. She hadn't come to humiliate anyone. She came to hold up a mirror. And finally, someone had looked into it. 3 days later, a statement was posted across all official airline channels. In light of recent events aboard Flight 207, our airline has placed the lead flight attendant on temporary suspension, pending a full internal review. We are also launching a system-wide reevaluation of our training protocols with special emphasis on ethics, cultural competency, and bias prevention. Gretchen Boyle read the words alone from a tablet in her kitchen. No phone calls came. No apologies were issued. No one tried to defend her. And perhaps for the first time she realized this wasn't going away. Not because of one incident, but because of all the ones that had gone unspoken until now. Across the country, stories began surfacing. #Respect Celeste had grown into more than just a viral moment. It became a trigger of memory, of conscience, of testimony. Passengers began sharing their own silent moments. Not all as dramatic, but all familiar. One of them was Andrew Tate, not the celebrity, but a retired English teacher from Buffalo who had been sitting in seat 5D on Flight 207. He had remained quiet during the incident, too unsure, too uncomfortable. But after seeing the press conference, something stirred in him. He sat in his home office, looked into his webcam, and hit record. "I was there," he said. "And I did nothing. I saw it happen. I saw the way she was treated and I didn't speak up. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure how." He looked away from the lens for a moment, then back again. "Well, now I know. Next time, I will." He uploaded it without fanfare. By morning, it had 1.2 million views. Isabel stood in front of the HR office, document in hand. It was official now. A formal internal complaint. Filed, signed, on the record. And at the bottom of the form, a transfer request. She had asked to leave Gretchen's crew. When the department head read her statement, he looked at her quietly. "You could have just asked for a different team," he said. She shook her head. "Not this time." Later that evening, as she packed up her flight kit, she felt lighter. She hadn't fixed everything, but she'd done something, and that counted. In Chicago, the ballroom was already full. The National Conference on Diversity and Ethics in Aviation had been planned for over a year, but today it carried a different energy. Word had traveled fast. Some came for the agenda, some came for the networking, but nearly all came for her. Celeste waited quietly backstage, mic clipped, blazer pressed. She had been here before. Different audiences, different cities, but never quite like this. The moderator took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but ringing clear through the chandelier-lit hall. "Here's the woman who just grounded Flight 207. not with anger, but with accountability. Applause surged, loud, sustained, not out of celebrity, but respect. Celeste stepped onto the stage, steady and unhurried. As she reached the podium, she didn't smile immediately. She paused, looked out at the crowd, and then she began. A few days ago, I was treated as if I didn't belong in a space I paid to enter, because someone assumed I didn't fit the image of who's supposed to sit in first class. But this story isn't about me. She let her gaze travel across the audience, faces of every age, every color, every uniform. It's about what happens when everyday bias goes unchecked, when good people convince themselves that silence is neutral, when the people entrusted with hospitality forget the human part. We don't need more policies. We need more courage. We need more Isabels. She let the silence settle. Deep, solid. Because justice doesn't wear a cape, it doesn't come with music, it walks in quietly, looks you in the eye, and says, we can do better. This time the applause wasn't explosive, it was thunderous, and when Celeste stepped away from the podium, she didn't bow, she simply walked off stage, head high, voice steady, mission still unfolding. The terminal had quieted by late afternoon. Gate announcements softened into background hums. Rolling suitcases whispered over polished tile. Somewhere, a child laughed near a vending machine. And in a corner cafe by Concourse C, Celeste Monroe sat alone at a window seat, her coffee cooling slowly between her hands. She wasn't rushing anywhere. Her next flight wasn't for hours, and for once she didn't mind the wait. The barista had recognized her, but didn't say anything, just handed over the drink with a nod that said, I know, and thank you. Celeste had nodded back. She didn't need headlines. She wasn't here for applause. She'd come for the long game. And the long game, she knew, was played in silence. She looked out the wide airport window. A 737 was taxiing slowly toward the runway, its wingtip lights blinking like distant stars. The sky above it was clear, faded blue, soft with early dusk. Then came the voice, gentle, a little raspy. Excuse me, Miss Monroe? Celeste turned. An older woman, maybe in her early 70s, stood beside her table. She wore a long gray cardigan and held a boarding pass in one hand, a small canvas bag in the other. I hope I'm not intruding, the woman said softly. Celeste shook her head. Not at all. The woman smiled, but there was weight behind her eyes. My daughter's a flight attendant, she said. Has been for 9 years. She paused, looked down at her hands. She called me last night, said her whole team watched your press conference, said it made her rethink how she handles everything, from how she looks at passengers to how she speaks to the new hires. She met Celeste's eyes, so I just wanted to say, thank you. Thank you for not screaming. Thank you for showing her a better way. Celeste held the woman's gaze, a quiet warmth rising in her chest. She didn't need to ask which airline her daughter worked for. Didn't need to know if she'd ever meet her. She already had. She gave a soft smile. Change doesn't always need a megaphone, Celeste said. Sometimes it just needs clarity. The woman nodded. Safe travels? Then she walked away. Celeste watched her blend back into the soft motion of the terminal. She took another sip of coffee, then looked back toward the window. The plane she'd been watching had begun its takeoff roll. Engines roaring, not in rage, but in purpose. The kind of sound that said we're rising now. She watched it lift from the ground, metal, lives, stories, rising against the pull of gravity. And she smiled. She wouldn't be on this flight, but something else was. Something invisible, but present. A shift. Not seismic, not loud, but real. And from now on, every time someone walked into a cabin unsure of whether they belonged, something in the air would feel just a little different. More watchful, more awake, more just. If this story touched you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, meaningful stories like this one. Your support helps us keep creating honest, human stories that matter. Thank you for being here, and for choosing to listen, even when the world goes quiet. Mr. Mac's Stories, where silence speaks and stories rise.